Welcome back to the polling station. It's Johnny Ward in the hot seat. It's been a pretty mad week on the football front, but things are developing on the political front as well. We're only a couple of weeks away from the elections, obviously, in London, and that's where we're going to start. What's happening, William Kedjanyi? It's going to be a question of can do, isn't it, again? And what are we looking at in terms of, I'm looking at polls here which would suggest that he's in a somewhat unassailable lead.
Yeah, and that's been the case for about a year. The most interesting thing about London's mayoral race now isn't actually even Khan's campaign. It's going to be his margin of victory, and it's going to be what, if any, lasting impact other candidates can make. I don't know where Sean Bailey's going to go after he gets beaten very badly by Khan. I imagine he'll do it in the first round. Bailey will be second, and clearly so, but it's been a disaster of a campaign.
Why has it gone so badly wrong?
I think it hasn't really been aimed at Londoners. I think much of Sean Bailey's campaign has basically been a big culture war gone wrong, which was the same tactic they tried with Zach Goldsmith. And in a way, actually, I think he's probably more useful in terms of running interference for the Tories on cultural issues that are outside of London. Maybe, just the surrounding areas, in the home counties, etc., where the Tories were trying to stoke up disagreements, etc., with Sadiq Khan. But certainly it hasn't gone well at all. I just don't think he's been a very competent operator. I think the Zach Goldsmith campaign, finding my words there, was a really bad one. And it was also very dog whistly, but at least he was a more competent operator than Bailey, who sort of just stumbled from gaff to gaff without ever really having the backing of the party. Indeed, there was a story a couple of months back, I think, about him either being replaced or the Tories dropping him as the candidate.
As of 5 hours ago, Election Maps UK, via the Savant to Comres poll of 13th to the 19th of April, Khan is at 41, Bailey 28.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Khan won by a little bit more than that. I think the margin of victory will be interesting, as will, of course, betting eventually when it comes up, which I'm sure it will, without the first two candidates as well, because you have Sian Berry of the Greens and Louisa Borrett of the Liberal Democrats, who are quite closely matched. So they're on, I think it's 8% and 6% in that poll, and the Greens and Lib Dems are actually having, under the radar, a little bit of an uptick in the polls at the moment. So that'll be interesting, as will how the culture warriors do. People like the unbelievably named, and I'm not lying to our viewers, I never would, Peter Gammons of UKIP, Brian Rose, Lawrence Fox, all headbangers running for publicity. We have had people use the London mayoralty to go on to, and I quote here, greater things in recent years. I don't think we'll be seeing too much more of them in the future, but it'll be interesting to see how the other contenders go, because there's a big field. I think it's 22 candidates, and certainly I think there'll be some interesting matches down the line.
Has Boris gone on to greater things?
For Boris Johnson, he has. I can't speak as to the rest of the country.
Yeah, let's just leave it there. The Senate constituency vote is very interesting. Looking at Patrick McGuire on Twitter, he's the red box editor for the Times. Labour at 40%, and Conservatives at 30%, played 19.
Yeah, that's the constituency vote for Sky News. For the Senate. And Labour are leading the list vote as well, 38 to 27%, with Plaid Cymru at 19. Really interesting thing. The seat projections leave Labour just short of majority on 29 seats. You need 30 to have outright control of the Welsh Parliament. I'll just call it. I won't attempt to pronounce Senate. Again, I think for the rest of this episode. This is quite a turnaround from some other polls, different pollsters, by the way, because YouGov back in mid-March had Labour on 32 and the Tories on 30 and Plaid on 23. And also, it's a big shift from the general election, which was bad for Labour in Wales, great for the Conservatives, really bad for Labour. There have been some quite significant changes over the last few years in Wales, and this is the toughest election, I think, for Welsh Labour as well, along with, of course, the fact that Welsh attitudes to the union are changing and changing quite notably.
Having voted for Brexit.
Having voted for Brexit as well, which is the big difference between them and Scotland and Northern Ireland, where you now have movements for independence that, well, in Scotland's case, have been well established, and also with Northern Ireland, but with Wales, it's been a more gradual process. It's only taken off recently. I think the performance of Plaid Cymru is going to be very interesting, obviously, and something to keep an eye on. Welsh Labour have been in office for 22 years, which is quite the stat, because we have been talking on the polling station recently about the longevity of governments. You know, the Tories have been in power in some way or another for 10 years. I think same for the SNP. So for Welsh Labour to complete 22 years and then get another majority would be quite the feat. And it looks as if Mark Drakeford, who has, I think it's fair to say, the best approval ratings by a decent margin in Wales in terms of First Minister preferences, is proving to be the big asset for the Welsh Labour Party, and that could be really crucial as we head to polling day.
Yeah, and just staying within the UK, the recent poll that was, I think, was just revealed essentially this morning on Northern Ireland. I've brought this up a little bit on the show, and in terms of we will have markets obviously in due course. There's no pressing need, like there's no pressing need for a border poll, but there's a narrow majority of Northern Ireland voters supporting remaining in the UK. I think this was carried out in March, this poll, which it showed quite interesting results. But there's been an amazing swing, really, in the sense of a few years, really, William, in the sense that United Ireland was really 1,000,000 to 1 about 10 years ago, and all of a sudden it really isn't. And the polls would suggest that. Although what I find quite interesting is what Southern attitudes will be. And Southern attitudes in this poll, 51% favour the United Ireland, with 27% backing the status quo. That's quite interesting, because I do look on when there's loyalist violence, as there has been over the last couple of weeks, and I'm not actually quite sure that the Southern certainty is as certain as it is in terms of accepting United Ireland in the south, which is something that isn't really said that much. But I think the southern voters can be scared out of it for economic and maybe security reasons. But it's a very, very interesting poll, this, and it was revealed this morning.
Yeah, indeed. I agreed with a lot of your points, and the last one you made about how difficult it can be to execute these things, I think, is very pertinent, because these separatist movements have been mooted for a long time. But I think in the case of Brexit, it's the first time we've actually seen it happen and take place. And the difficulty of that, not even just on a cultural basis, but also in terms of economics and also legal frameworks and agreements, I think is potentially rather off-putting for voters who may be leaning towards independence, or in one way or another, whether they be in Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland, but who suddenly are faced with the realities of putting something like this together. And I think that's going to be a big part, actually, of the next Scottish independence referendum, if there is one in the relatively near future. We do have a market on when it will next happen, for which we are 10 to 11 each of two before the end of 2025. I personally think it will probably be after that, given the electoral cycle. But I think it's going to be a big thing. How are you going to pull this off? Where do these independent nation states go? Because, in the same way that Britain is always going to be in Europe geographically, these countries are always going to be on the British mainland. except in the case of Northern Ireland. And that's a big thing, which I think is going to become a more pronounced question, especially as we won't leave the pandemic in, you know, a split second or whatever, but as we sort of move through the next political cycle, and they do change, it is cyclical, there's definitely going to be more questions about, you know, how does an independent Scotland pay for itself? You know, what does a united Ireland look like, and how can you guarantee X or Y, you know, especially given the border issue? And I think it's something to keep an eye on, because there will be markets about this thing, and there will be markets about these things, and opportunities to make big trades.
If nothing else, it's really, really interesting if you follow British politics and Irish politics, because the next 10, 15, 20 years are going to be really, really seminal and, you know, I think life-changing for a lot of people. And, you know, but, you know, those who pine for United Ireland from a sort of a nationalist leaning back in the day, they now maybe reflect on, you know, the success of the Southern economy, albeit hugely reliant on multinationals and our low corporate tax rate, and the fact that the Northern Irish economy is miles behind us. And let's be frank, and I still think, without trying to in any way espouse violence, I think Southern voters can be scared out of voting for United Ireland. That's probably something that I'll return to. But let's return to Hartlepool. We can't get through a show without you, of course.
Just quickly on that note of voters being scared off, it's an important one. It's played a big part in elections too. There was a big fear of the SNP and Labour coming together when Miliband was Labour leader. Many people credit that with giving the Tories the correct sort of platform for them to really damage Labour. Now, obviously, you know, I do think Labour was sort of regressing, or certainly New Labour was regressing, and, you know, they were on the downward slope, but that can play a big part in elections. You know, the scare factor in both ways. You know, some people will say, look at how badly Brexit went, do you want that? But some people will also say, well, you could be stuck with Britain forever if you don't take this chance.
Yeah, I mean, and if you look at the scare tactics that Donald Trump involved, you know, involving obviously scaring voters to think that they were electing an effective communist in Joe Biden, which was absolutely fanciful, but would have had an effect. Whereas in the United Ireland, you can bring up very real fears, and a lot of the population here wouldn't know the first thing about East Belfast or the areas that would have been obviously involved in these riots last week. As much as I'm entirely in favour of United Ireland, I think it's one thing voting for something in a poll, and that isn't going to happen in the near future. And it's another thing actually going to the polls. But we cannot get through an episode of this show without mentioning the Hartlepool by-election.
We cannot, and we absolutely should not. And watch this space for lots more on Hartlepool. So the market has hardened around the Tories. They're
4-7 now.
Yeah, 4-7 now. Labour 5-4. You can get 33-1 for the Northern Independence Party. If you back them, we'll credit Felber Walker's performance as that, because of course, unfortunately, the Northern Independence Party couldn't register in time with the Electoral Commission. There was a bit of a situation there. So Felber Walker's going to stand as an independent, and she'll run under that banner. So if you back her with us, you'll get paid out on her performance. We are win only at the moment though, and they are 33-1. We're 50-1 for Reform UK, 100s for Sam Lee, the Independents, 200s for Liberal Democrats, 200-1 for Ralph Ward Jackson, another independent, 500-1 for the Freedom Alliance, the Heritage Party, and the Women's Equality Party, and 1,000-1 for the official Monster Raving Loony Party, if that's your bag. We had a deep discussion about Hartlepool with Paul Krishnamurti, friend of the show, hopefully to return soon. And I'd still be of the opinion the Conservatives are the bet, and I think best placed. Although we mustn't forget the impact local campaigns can have there. I went to Peterborough and I was there for the day of the by-election, and it was a big shock, pretty big shock, when Labour held the seat in the Corbyn era. They were expected widely to lose it. They didn't, and the rest is history, as they say.
What can happen in the next? I read an interesting interview with Keir Starmer couple of Sundays back, and he came across very well in it. And the point was made that he obviously needs to kind of he needs to display this kind of charisma to the electorate. But how much of the British electorate's mind now is essentially on two things? One is just getting out of the pandemic, and two, Brexit. And like, is Boris kind of doing okay then in that regard? The Conservatives can kind of cling on for the time being.
I mean, to be fair, I don't even think it's a matter of clinging on. The Tories have just always tended to poll around 40 for a few years now. It feels like forever. And not much really has hurt their poll ratings. I think there are certain reasons behind that. We have to remember that different voting groups have different interests. I think people have been disappointed in Keir Starmer so far. There was a promise, I think, that a lot of people got swept up in, mainly because he wasn't Jeremy Corbyn. But I think some of the areas that Corbyn did do well in, particularly in terms of coming across as a politician who believed what he was saying, who had his pure convictions, Starmer hasn't done so well in. And I think possibly his image might have been made ready for him. I do think there are certain difficulties, I know, to being the leader of the opposition in a pandemic when the government is at the centre of everything.
You're also damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
Yeah, to a point. Although I'd say we definitely haven't seen enough in the way of really aggressive policy from Labour. And when Theresa May, just to go back a couple of years, when Theresa May was Prime Minister, there was always a lot of briefing about how the Tories had their tanks on Labour's lawn. Admittedly, from friendly press, definitely, but there was always a lot of talk about, this is a really big shift. This is the Tories doing Labour style things. Last year has proven that really has been the case. It has been much of that 2017-2019 manifesto writ large, and it's difficult to respond to that. How can you be economically radical or be seen to be economically radical when the state's been paying 80% of everybody's wages, giving business grants or whatever, here, there, and everywhere, a whole load of other measures as well, each of them announced by the government at these press conferences? It can be difficult to really get a foothold with that. But that's
been interesting for Sinn Féin here as well, and in Northern Ireland indeed. And a fascinating article about Sinn Féin in the Irish Times by Michael McDougall today. He was obviously a former minister here, which I'd implore you to read if you get a chance. But that's a very, very real issue. It's been difficult for the left, also for the fact that, especially in Ireland, with all the various, different kind of strains of the coronavirus, nobody's really known the right answer at any stage.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
And nobody cares about anything else right now. Nobody really cares about housing. Nobody cares about anything except for when we can actually leave our houses and go on holiday again.
Yeah, and it's going to be a really, really big factor in sort of economic confidence and electoral polling. The vaccine drive, even if you wouldn't attribute it to the government directly, it's certainly going to put them in a very strong position. I do believe that these other issues, such as housing and the environment, etc., will come more chiefly into play. And with the next election cycle, we're 30 to 100 on. That it's 2024 or later. That's a lot of time. But the issue is that sometimes once the cycle is set, it's very difficult to make waves or make any changes. And it feels already like we're in that sort of drumbeat. It feels like, we could already predict until we vote at the next election somewhere about 40 to 43% with a margin of error of 3. And that would be enough, I think, probably for another majority, which is 13 to 8 with us. And a price that, it's a long time to have your money tied up, but it's a price that interests me. I would be surprised if they went to 13 to 8 for majority, even if it was in 2024.
What else have we got?
Lots of markets to be added, but still good stuff on the website. We have the a Keir Starmer exit date on that notice. We are 5 to 4 on he goes in 2024 or later, 7 to 2 this year, 5 to 1 for next year, and 6 to 1 for 2023. I can see the 5-1 for next year becoming shorter. You've got a full sort of 12 months to run. It's difficult to see Labour getting rid of him this year unless the local elections are a pure and absolute disaster. And even then, he's got most of the party, and other people need to get the houses in order. But if he can't be as close as he was last winter with the schools debacle by this time next year, people will begin to get shifty. And we've got leaders from the next party, Market's up. Sunak is 7-4 for the Conservatives to be next Conservative Party leader. Rayner is 5-1 favourite for the next permanent Labour Party leader. We've also got a next Scottish First Minister, Market, Angus Robson 4-1 there, John Swinney 11-2. And of course, we can't forget the fact we do have the Holyrood markets too. The Tories have gone 2-on to be the second biggest party in terms of seats, and the SNP are 4-6 for a majority now.
Thank you, William.
Thank you very much.
That was the polling station. Next week, maybe we'll delve a little bit more into the European markets, as well as being a little bit of movement in France, and we'll see what's going on in Germany. But we hope you enjoyed that. Very interesting times in Ireland and the United Kingdom. Very interesting days ahead, much of which we'll discuss on the polling station.